disturbing. Tonight, we are plunging into the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains with some truly unsettling true horror stories that will keep you up all night, if you're brave enough. Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into fear. Now, get comfortable, relax. I've been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for about 7 years now, usually with my brother Mike and our friend Dave. We're not through hikers or anything extreme like that, just regular guys who love getting out on the weekends, clearing our heads, and putting some miles behind us. We've covered most of Virginia and North Carolina over the years, but in October of 2019, we decided to tackle a section we'd never done before, a 3-day stretch through the mountains of western North Carolina, starting just north of Hot Springs. The plan was simple enough. We'd parked Dave's truck at a trail crossing near Marshall, then driven my car about 30 miles south to start our hike northbound. 3 days, 2 nights, covering about 45 miles through some of the most remote country the AT passes through in that part of the state. The weather was perfect for October hiking. Crisp mornings in the 40s, warm afternoons in the mid-60s, and the leaves were just starting to turn. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The first day went exactly as planned. We made good time, covering about 18 miles before setting up camp near a small stream. The trail was in great condition, the views were spectacular, and we had that familiar rhythm going that comes when you've hiked with the same people for years. Mike was in his usual good mood, cracking jokes and pointing out interesting plants. Dave was doing his thing with the GPS, constantly checking our position and calculating our pace. And I was just enjoying being out there, away from work and responsibilities and the constant noise of everyday life. That first night, we sat around our small camp stove, eating rehydrated chili and talking about the next day's hike. According to our map, we'd be crossing some higher ridges, with a few decent climbs, but nothing too challenging. The weather forecast was holding steady, clear skies and mild temperatures. We turned in early, tired but satisfied, listening to the night sounds of the forest as we drifted off to sleep. The second day started just as well. We broke camp before sunrise, eager to tackle the more challenging terrain ahead. The trail climbed steadily through dense hardwood forest, and as we gained elevation, the views opened up to reveal rolling mountains stretching to the horizon in every direction. The fall colors were incredible, deep reds and bright oranges and golden yellows that seemed to glow in the morning light. We stopped for lunch at a small clearing where the trail made a sharp switchback, enjoying the panoramic view while we ate our sandwiches and drank water. That's when Mike spotted something unusual down in the hollow below us. "Hey, what's that red thing down there?" he asked, pointing through the trees to our left. I followed his gaze and saw what he was talking about. A bright red object, maybe 50 yards off the trail and about 30 feet down the slope. From our position, it looked like it might be a piece of clothing or maybe a tarp, but it was hard to tell through the trees. Could be gear someone dropped, Dave suggested, or maybe a tent. But something about it bothered me. The color was too bright, too vivid against the muted browns and grays of the forest floor, and it wasn't moving in the slight breeze that was rustling the leaves around us. "Should we check it out?" Mike asked. I was about to say no. We had a schedule to keep, and bushwhacking down a steep slope wasn't exactly appealing. But curiosity got the better of me. We'd all heard stories about hikers who'd gotten lost or injured and wandered off the trail. Maybe someone needed help. "Let's take a quick look," I said. "But if it's just trash, we're not hauling it back up." We stashed our packs at the clearing and carefully made our way down the slope, grabbing onto tree trunks and saplings to keep from slipping on the loose leaves. The terrain was steeper than it had looked from above, and by the time we reached the bottom of the hollow, we were all breathing hard. The red object turned out to be a shirt, a bright red flannel shirt that looked like it had been there for a while. It was partially buried under fallen leaves, and when Dave pulled it free, we could see that it was torn and stained with something dark that might have been blood. "Jesus," Mike muttered. "That doesn't look good." But the shirt wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was what we found when we started looking around the immediate area. About 10 feet away, partially hidden by a fallen log, was what looked like a shallow depression in the earth. At first glance, it might have been a natural hollow, but when I knelt down and brushed away the leaves, I could see that the edges were too straight, too uniform. "Guys," I called out, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Come look at this." Mike and Dave hurried over, and when they saw what I was looking at, neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Is that what I think it is?" Dave finally asked. I nodded, unable to speak. It was definitely a grave, or at least it had been dug to look like one. It was roughly 6 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide, with neat, squared-off edges that showed clear signs of having been excavated with a shovel. The dirt had been tamped down, but not well enough to completely hide the fact that it had been disturbed. "There's another one over here," Mike called from about 20 yards away, his voice tight with tension. We found 4 graves in total, all roughly the same size and shape, all showing signs of recent digging despite being partially covered with leaves and forest debris. They were arranged in no particular pattern that we could discern, scattered around the bottom of the hollow like someone had been interrupted in the middle of their work. The smell hit us then, a sweet, sickly odor that seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was definitely there, and it made my stomach turn. Dave actually gagged and had to step away from the nearest grave. "We need to get out of here," he said, his face pale. "Right now." But Mike had found something else, a piece of yellow rope, maybe 8 feet long, tied in a series of complex knots that looked almost ritualistic. One end was frayed, like it had been cut, and there were dark stains on several sections. "What the hell is this place?" he asked, holding up the rope. I was about to tell him to drop it when we heard something that made us all freeze. The sound of footsteps coming from somewhere uphill and getting closer. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that suggested someone was making their way down the slope toward us. We looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in their faces. Without saying a word, we started moving back toward the trail, abandoning any pretense of careful footing as we scrambled up the steep incline. The footsteps seemed to be following us, but when I looked back, I couldn't see anyone through the trees. By the time we reached our packs, we were all breathing hard and sweating despite the cool air. Mike was clutching the rope he'd found, and Dave still had the red shirt. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other and trying to process what we'd discovered. "We have to report this," I said finally. "Those were graves, fresh graves." "But what if—" Dave started, then trailed off. "What if what?" "What if whoever dug them is still around?" It was a question none of us wanted to think about, but we couldn't ignore it. The footsteps we'd heard could have been an animal, or they could have been something else entirely. And if those graves were as recent as they appeared to be, there was a good chance that whoever had dug them might still be in the area. We packed up quickly and started hiking again, but the mood had completely changed. The beautiful fall afternoon now felt ominous and threatening. Every sound in the forest made us jump, and we found ourselves constantly looking back over our shoulders. The trail that had seemed so peaceful and inviting just hours earlier now felt like it was leading us deeper into something we didn't understand. We made it to our planned campsite by late afternoon, but none of us felt like setting up camp. The site was in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, and after what we'd found, the isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt dangerous. "I don't want to spend the night here," Mike said, voicing what we were all thinking. "But it's getting dark," Dave pointed out, "and we're still 15 miles from the car." We compromised by hiking another 3 miles to a shelter we'd passed on our way south the day before. It was an old wooden lean-to that had seen better days, but it felt safer than camping alone in the woods. There were a few other hikers there, a young couple from Georgia and an older man who introduced himself as a section hiker from Tennessee. We tried to act normal, sharing the shelter and making small talk about the trail, but I could tell that Mike and Dave were as on edge as I was. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness, we all tensed up. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those graves, about the rope and the shirt and that sweet, sick smell. Who had dug them? And why? The questions went round and round in my head, but I couldn't come up with any answers that made sense. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the shelter. Slow, careful footsteps that seemed to circle the clearing where we were camped. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, until they finally faded away. In the morning, I asked the others if they'd heard anything, but they all said no. Maybe it had been a dream, or maybe the stress of the day had made me paranoid. But I didn't think so. We broke camp early the next morning, eager to finish the hike and get back to civilization. The other hikers were planning to stay another night, but we made our excuses and hit the trail as soon as it was light enough to see. The final day of hiking passed in a blur of nervous energy and forced conversation. We covered the last 15 miles in record time, barely stopping to rest or eat. By early afternoon, we were back at Dave's truck, loading our gear and trying to pretend that everything was normal. But as we drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone following us, but the road behind us remained empty. When we got back to town, we went straight to the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty was a middle-aged woman who listened politely as we described what we'd found, but I could tell she wasn't taking us entirely seriously. "You found some shallow holes in the woods," she said when we'd finished our story, "and some old clothes and rope." "They were graves," Mike insisted. "Fresh graves, and there was a smell." She made a note on her pad. "We'll send someone out to take a look," she said. "Can you give me the exact location?" We did our best to describe where we'd found the site, using landmarks and GPS coordinates that Dave had recorded. The deputy took down all the information and promised to follow up, but something in her manner suggested that she'd heard stories like this before. "You boys have been watching too many horror movies," she said as we were leaving. "The woods can play tricks on your imagination, especially when you're tired and stressed." But I knew what we'd seen, and it wasn't our imagination. Over the next few weeks, I found myself obsessing over what we'd discovered. I spent hours online, searching for news stories about missing hikers or unsolved disappearances in that part of North Carolina. What I found was disturbing. There had been several hikers who'd gone missing in that area over the past few years. Day hikers and overnight backpackers who'd simply vanished without a trace. The authorities had conducted searches, but nothing had ever been found. No bodies, no gear, no signs of what might have happened to them. One story in particular caught my attention. A young couple from Virginia had disappeared while hiking in the same general area where we'd found the graves. They'd been reported missing when they failed to return from what was supposed to be a 3-day backpacking trip. Their car had been found at a trailhead, but despite extensive searches, no trace of them had ever been discovered. The article was dated just 6 months before our trip. I called the sheriff's office several times over the following weeks, asking about the investigation into our report. Each time I was told that someone would get back to me, but no one ever did. Finally, I drove back down to North Carolina and went to the sheriff's office in person. This time I spoke with a different deputy, a young man who seemed genuinely concerned about our report. He pulled up the file and confirmed that they had indeed sent someone out to investigate the site we'd described. "What did they find?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable. "Nothing," he said. The investigating officer reported that the site had been cleared. No evidence of any disturbance. "Cleared? What do you mean, cleared?" "Just that there was nothing there. No graves, no personal effects, nothing out of the ordinary." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "That's impossible. We saw what we saw." He shrugged. "I'm just telling you what's in the report. The site was investigated and found to be clear." I left the sheriff's office more confused and frustrated than ever. Had we been wrong about what we'd seen? Had our imaginations really gotten the better of us? But I remembered the smell, the carefully dug holes, the rope with its strange knots. None of that had been our imagination. That night, I called Mike and Dave and told them what the deputy had said. Mike was as skeptical as I was. "Someone cleaned up that site," he said. "They knew we'd reported it, and they went back and covered their tracks." "But who?" Dave asked. "And why?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks, and I still didn't have an answer. Over the months that followed, I found myself returning to the area again and again, both physically and mentally. I hiked other sections of the trail in North Carolina, always keeping an eye out for anything unusual. I researched local history, looking for patterns or connections that might explain what we'd found. What I discovered was a region with a long history of isolation and secretiveness. There were stories going back generations about strange occurrences in the mountains, people who'd gone missing, unexplained lights in the sky, reports of cult activity and ritualistic behavior. Most of it could be dismissed as local folklore, but the sheer volume of stories was unsettling. I also learned that the area where we'd made our discovery was known to local law enforcement as a problem spot. There had been reports over the years of illegal hunting, drug activity, and other criminal behavior. But whenever I tried to get specific information, I ran into a wall of silence and evasion. It's been over 4 years now since that October day when we found the graves, and I still think about it regularly. I still wonder who dug those holes and why. I wonder what happened to the people who might have been buried there, and whether they're still out there somewhere, or if they've become part of the forest floor. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed and investigated further, or if we should have tried harder to get the authorities to take us seriously. But mostly, I'm just grateful that we got out of there when we did. I still hike the Appalachian Trail, but I've never been back to that particular section in North Carolina. Mike and Dave feel the same way. We've found plenty of other beautiful places to explore, places that don't carry the weight of unanswered questions and lingering dread. But I know that somewhere out there, in a hollow off the trail in the mountains of western North Carolina, there are answers to questions I don't think I really want to ask. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if whoever dug those graves is still out there, still working in the darkness, still adding to their collection. I hope I never find out. I've been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for about 8 years now, usually solo trips on weekends when I can get away from my job in Richmond. There's something about those old mountains that pulls me back, the way the morning mist clings to the ridgelines, how the forest seems to breathe with centuries of history. I'm not some hardcore thru hiker or anything, just a guy who finds peace in the woods and enjoys the challenge of a good day's trek. This particular trip was in late October 2023, and I'd planned to tackle a 20-mile section through the mountains of West Virginia, near the Virginia border. I'd driven up on a Friday night and camped at a trailhead parking area, planning to start early Saturday morning. The weather forecast looked perfect. Crisp fall temperatures, partly cloudy skies, and that golden autumn light that makes every photo look like a postcard. I wasn't alone this time. My younger brother Jake had finally agreed to join me after months of pestering. He was 24, worked in IT, and spent most of his free time gaming or watching Netflix. Getting him outdoors was like pulling teeth, but our mom had been after both of us to spend more time together since Dad passed 2 years ago. So there we were, two brothers with completely different ideas about fun, preparing to spend 3 days together in the wilderness. Jake complained about everything from the weight of his pack to the lack of cell service, but I could tell he was starting to enjoy himself as we made our way up the initial climb Saturday morning. The trail was in good condition, well marked, and the fall colors were absolutely spectacular. Reds and golds blazed against the evergreens, and the air had that clean, sharp quality that only comes with elevation and season. We made good time through the morning, stopping frequently for Jake to catch his breath and take photos with his phone. Around noon, we reached a scenic overlook where we planned to have lunch. The view stretched for miles across rolling mountains, layer after layer fading into the blue distance. Jake actually put his phone away for a while and just sat quietly, taking it in. "I get it now," he said, unwrapping a sandwich. "Why you come out here, I mean. It's like the world stops." I was glad to hear it. Maybe I'd finally converted him. After lunch, we continued along the ridgeline. The trail here was relatively easy, following the contours of the mountain through mixed hardwood forest. We were making casual conversation, talking about work and family, when Jake suddenly stopped. "Hey, what's that over there?" He was pointing off the trail, maybe 30 yards into the woods. I followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. a glint of metal among the fallen leaves, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. At first glance, it looked like maybe someone had dropped a piece of camping gear. Probably just trash, I said, but Jake was already picking his way through the undergrowth toward it. Come on, let's check it out. Might be something valuable someone lost. I followed reluctantly, careful not to step on any of the rotting logs or hidden rocks scattered through the forest floor. As we got closer, I could see it was some kind of metal container, roughly the size of a small toolbox, with a dark gray finish that had begun to rust around the edges. Jake reached it first and crouched down beside it. "It's a metal box," he called back to me. "Looks pretty old. Heavy, too." He was trying to lift it with one hand. When I reached him, I could see the box more clearly. It was definitely old. The metal had that patina that comes from years of exposure to the elements, though it was partially protected by the tree canopy. There was no visible lock, just a simple latch that looked like it might still work. "Should we open it?" Jake asked, looking up at me with the kind of excitement he hadn't shown since we started hiking. I hesitated. Something about finding a random metal box this far off the trail felt odd. "I don't know, man. Maybe we should leave it alone. Could be someone's geocache or something." "Geocache?" Jake laughed. "Out here, there's no GPS signal for miles." He was already working at the latch with his fingers. "Besides, if it's been here long enough to get this rusty, whoever left it probably isn't coming back." The latch gave way with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Jake lifted the lid, and we both leaned in to see what was inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not exactly decay, but something musty and unpleasant, like old paper left in a damp basement. The box was lined with what looked like faded cloth, maybe an old towel or blanket, and sitting on top of that was a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "Holy shit," Jake whispered. "This is like finding treasure." I wasn't so sure. Something about the whole setup felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The box was too deliberately placed, too carefully preserved for something that had supposedly been abandoned in the woods. Jake reached for the envelope, but I caught his wrist. "Wait, maybe we shouldn't." "Are you serious? We find a mysterious box in the middle of nowhere and you don't want to see what's inside?" He pulled his hand free and carefully lifted the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, and I could see there were multiple items inside. Against my better judgment, I found myself curious too. Jake opened the envelope and slowly pulled out its contents. There were 3 items: a folded piece of notebook paper, several photographs, and what looked like a small notebook or journal. The paper was yellowed and brittle-looking, with handwriting in blue ink that had faded but was still legible. Jake unfolded the paper carefully and began to read aloud. "If you're reading this, then you found what I couldn't show the police. I tried to do the right thing, but nobody would listen. Maybe someone else will have better luck." He paused and looked at me. "This is getting weird." "Keep reading," I said, though part of me wanted to put everything back and walk away. "The photos will show you what I saw. The dates are written on the back. I took them between September 15th and October 3rd, 1997. I know how it sounds, but I'm not making this up. Check the missing person reports from that time if you don't believe me." Jake set the letter aside and picked up the photographs. They were standard 4R6 prints, the kind you used to get developed at drugstores. But they'd faded with age, and the colors looked slightly off. The first few showed what appeared to be a campsite, a tent, a backpack, some camping gear scattered around. Nothing particularly unusual. But as Jake flipped through them, the images became more disturbing. There were photos of what looked like drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the campsite toward a dense section of forest. Another showed what might have been pieces of torn fabric caught on branches. The final photograph made my stomach drop. It showed what appeared to be a shallow depression in the ground, partially covered with leaves and branches, but you could still make out what looked like the edge of a sleeping bag or piece of blue fabric underneath. "Jesus Christ," Jake said quietly. "What the hell is this?" I took the photos from him and flipped them over. Sure enough, there were dates written in the same blue ink as the letter, ranging from September 15th to October 3rd, 1997. There were also brief descriptions, Campsite day 1. Strange tracks. Something buried here. Jake had opened the small notebook and was flipping through the pages. Most of it appeared to be some kind of journal or log with dates and brief entries. I could make out fragments as he turned the pages. Voices at night. Someone watching. Camp. Found more evidence. We need to put this back, I said suddenly. The whole thing felt wrong, like we were intruding on something private and potentially dangerous. This isn't our business. Are you insane? Jake looked at me like I'd lost my mind. This could be evidence of a crime. Someone went missing and whoever wrote this letter tried to report it, but nobody listened. We have to do something. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. If these photos really showed evidence of something that happened to a missing person, we couldn't just ignore it. Still, something about the whole situation made my skin crawl. Okay, I said finally. But let's get back to the trail first. We can figure out what to do once we're somewhere with cell service. Jake carefully put everything back in the envelope and closed the metal box. Should we take it with us? I considered this. The box wasn't particularly large, but it would add weight to our packs, and we still had 2 more days of hiking ahead of us. On the other hand, leaving it here meant someone else might find it, or worse, whoever had originally hidden it might come back. Yeah, let's take it, I decided, but we're not opening it again until we get home. Jake agreed, and we managed to strap the box to the outside of his pack using some bungee cords. It threw off his balance a bit, but he insisted he could manage. As we made our way back to the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful and welcoming earlier, now felt ominous. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us, but there was never anyone there. You okay? Jake asked as we reached the trail. You seem jumpy. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied. Just thinking about what we found. We continued, hiking, but the mood had definitely changed. Our earlier easy conversation dried up, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the sound of our boots on the trail and the occasional bird call. Even Jake seemed affected by it, glancing around, nervously and jumping at every unexpected sound. The trail began to descend toward our planned campsite for the night, a small clearing beside a stream about 5 miles from where we'd found the box. Normally, this would have been one of my favorite parts of the day, the anticipation of making camp, cooking dinner, and settling in for a peaceful evening in the woods. Instead, I found myself dreading nightfall. We reached the campsite around 4 in the afternoon, giving us plenty of time to set up before dark. It was a nice spot, a level area beside a small creek with a stone fire ring and a couple of logs arranged as seats. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect. Jake seemed to have gotten his second wind and was actually enthusiastic about making camp. He'd been practicing with his new tent at home and wanted to show off how quickly he could set it up. I was grateful for the distraction and threw myself into the familiar routine of making camp, filtering water, gathering firewood, preparing dinner. But as the sun began to set, that feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. The forest around our campsite was dense, creating deep shadows even in the fading daylight. Every time I looked up from what I was doing, I expected to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing, but there was never anyone there. Hey, Jake said suddenly. Did you hear that? I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal sounds of the forest settling in for the night. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost like someone walking through dry leaves coming from somewhere in the woods behind Jake's tent. We both stood perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely rhythmic, like footsteps. Probably just a deer, I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Deer don't walk with that kind of measured pace. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. Usually, the forest at this time of evening would be full of sounds. Insects, night birds, small animals moving through the underbrush. But now there was nothing. It was as if every living thing in the woods had suddenly gone quiet. "I don't like this," Jake said quietly. "Something feels wrong." I couldn't argue with him. Every instinct I had was telling me we needed to leave, but it was getting dark and we were miles from the nearest road. Besides, we might just be spooked by what we'd found earlier. Finding that box and those photos had put us both on edge. "Let's just stick to the plan," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll keep the fire going all night and take turns staying awake. In the morning we can decide whether to continue or head back." Jake nodded, though he didn't look convinced. We finished setting up camp in relative silence, both of us jumping at every small sound. I noticed Jake kept glancing toward the woods behind his tent, and I found myself doing the same thing. Dinner was a quiet affair. We'd planned to cook over the fire, but neither of us felt like spending the time necessary to get a good cooking fire going. Instead, we used our camp stoves and ate quickly, barely tasting the food. As full darkness settled over the campsite, we built up the fire and settled in beside it. The flames provided some comfort, creating a circle of light that pushed back the oppressive darkness of the forest. But they also made everything beyond their reach seem even darker and more threatening. "Tell me again why we took that box," Jake said, staring into the flames. "Because it might be evidence," I replied, though I was starting to question that decision myself. "Evidence of what exactly?" "A 25-year-old disappearance that nobody investigated properly the first time." Jake shook his head. "Maybe we should have left it where we found it." Before I could respond, we both heard it again, the sound of footsteps in the woods, this time coming from a different direction. They were slow and deliberate, circling our campsite at what sounded like a consistent distance. "Okay, that's definitely not a deer," Jake whispered. I stood up slowly, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was complete and unnatural. Even the sound of the creek seemed muffled. "Maybe it's another hiker," Jake suggested hopefully. "Someone who saw our fire and is being cautious about approaching." At this time of night, miles from the nearest shelter? I shook my head. No way. We sat back down, but neither of us relaxed. The footsteps didn't resume, but I had the distinct feeling that whoever or whatever had been circling our camp was still out there, watching us. "I'm getting the pepper spray out of my pack," Jake said, standing up. "Good idea. I'll get mine too." We both retrieved our bear spray, small canisters of concentrated pepper spray that were supposed to deter aggressive wildlife. I wasn't sure how effective they'd be against a human, but they were better than nothing. The next few hours passed slowly. We took turns adding wood to the fire and trying to stay alert, but the combination of exhaustion and adrenaline was taking its toll. Every sound made us jump. A branch falling somewhere in the distance, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Around midnight, Jake was nodding off in spite of himself when I heard a new sound that made my blood run cold. It was coming from somewhere behind my tent, a low, rhythmic scraping noise like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. "Jake," I whispered urgently. "Wake up." He jerked awake instantly. "What is it?" "Listen." The scraping sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I could swear I heard something else, a faint whispering sound, too indistinct to make out any words. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. I nodded. "We need to stay awake. Both of us." "Fuck that," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. "We need to get out of here. It's the middle of the night. We can't navigate the trail in the dark, especially carrying full packs." "Then we wait until first light and we get the hell out of here." I couldn't argue with that logic. Whatever was happening, it was clear we weren't welcome in these woods. The rest of the night passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear. The sounds continued intermittently. Footsteps, scraping, and occasional whispers that seemed to come from different directions around our campsite. Neither of us got any real sleep. We just sat by the fire, feeding it wood and jumping at every sound. As dawn finally began to break, the sounds gradually faded away. The normal chorus of morning birds returned, and the oppressive feeling that had dominated the night began to lift. In the growing daylight, our campsite looked perfectly normal. No signs of disturbance, No evidence that anyone had been watching us all night. "Did that really happen?" Jake asked, looking around the peaceful clearing. I was wondering the same thing myself. In the bright morning light, the events of the night seemed almost dreamlike. Had we really heard all those sounds? Or had our imaginations run away with us after finding that disturbing box? But when I walked around the perimeter of our campsite, I found something that made my stomach drop. There, in the soft earth beside the creek, was a series of footprints. They were human, definitely adult-sized, and they formed a rough circle around where we'd been sitting by the fire. "Jake," I called quietly, "come look at this." He joined me beside the creek and stared down at the prints. "Those weren't there yesterday." No, they weren't. The footprints were clear and recent, pressed deep into the mud beside the water. Whoever had made them had been wearing boots, hiking boots from the look of the tread pattern. They'd stood here for some time, watching us. "We're leaving," Jake said firmly. "Right now." I didn't argue. We broke camp in record time, stuffing our gear into our packs without our usual care for organization. The metal box went back onto Jake's pack, secured with the bungee cords. Within 30 minutes, we were back on the trail, heading north toward the parking area where we'd left my car. The hike back was tense and silent. We made much better time than we had the previous day, driven by a mutual desire to get as far away from that campsite as possible. Every sound in the forest made us nervous, and we found ourselves constantly looking over our shoulders. But as the morning wore on and we put more distance between ourselves and the campsite, I began to feel a little foolish. In the bright daylight, with other hikers beginning to appear on the trail, our fear seemed overblown. Maybe we'd just spooked ourselves with that box and its contents. Still, those footprints had been real. Someone had been watching us during the night. We reached the parking area by early afternoon, hours ahead of our original schedule. My car was exactly where I'd left it, covered in a light coating of dew, but otherwise undisturbed. As I loaded our packs into the back, I felt a huge sense of relief. "So what do we do with this?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the metal box. "I guess we turn it over to the authorities," I said. "Let them figure out if it's legitimate or just someone's idea of a sick joke." The drive back to Richmond gave us time to decompress and talk through what had happened. In the safety of the car, with the radio playing and the familiar sight of civilization passing by the windows, the events of the previous night seemed less threatening. We convinced ourselves that we'd probably overreacted, that the sounds we'd heard could have been explained by wildlife or other hikers. But those footprints were harder to explain away. Back home, I did some research online while Jake called around to find out which law enforcement agency would be most appropriate to contact. It turned out that the section of trail where we'd been hiking fell under the jurisdiction of the local sheriff's department, supplemented by park rangers during busy seasons. My internet search turned up some interesting information. I found several missing person reports from the fall of 1997 that matched the time frame mentioned in the letter we'd found. A college student named Jennifer Walsh had disappeared while camping alone on the Appalachian Trail in early October of that year. Her campsite had been found abandoned, with her gear scattered and signs of a struggle, but her body was never recovered. The case had received some media attention at the time, but the investigation had eventually gone cold. According to the news articles I found, there had been several reported sightings of Jennifer after her disappearance, but none of them had been confirmed. There was also mention of a hiker who had claimed to have evidence related to Jennifer's disappearance, but who had been dismissed by investigators as unreliable. The articles didn't give the person's name, but the timing matched the letter we'd found. Jake called the sheriff's department on Monday morning and explained the situation. The deputy who took his call was polite, but seemed less than enthusiastic about our discovery. He took down our contact information and said someone would get back to us to arrange a time to examine the box and its contents. "How did he sound?" I asked after Jake hung up. "Like he thought we were a couple of nuts who'd been watching too many true crime shows," Jake replied. But he said they'd look into it. 3 days later, a deputy sheriff named Rodriguez came to my apartment to pick up the box. He was professional and courteous, but I got the impression he was going through the motions rather than treating this as a serious potential break in a cold case. "We appreciate you turning this in," he said as I handed over the box. "We'll have our detectives take a look and see if there's anything useful here." "What about the Jennifer Walsh case?" I asked. This could be related to her disappearance. Deputy Rodriguez gave me a look that suggested he'd heard this kind of thing before. "We'll check it out, sir. If we need any additional information from you, we'll be in touch." That was the last I heard from them for several weeks. Jake called a few times to follow up, but each time he was told the case was still under review. Meanwhile, I found myself unable to stop thinking about what we'd experienced in the woods. I kept replaying the events of that night, trying to convince myself that we'd imagined the sounds and that the footprints could have been made by another hiker who happened to pass by our campsite. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something much darker than a simple cold case. Someone had been watching us that night, and I had the uncomfortable suspicion that our discovery of the box hadn't been accidental. I started having trouble sleeping. Every night sound, a car door slamming, footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, the building settling, made me jump. I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows obsessively, and I started keeping the pepper spray on my nightstand. Jake seemed to be handling it better than I was, at least on the surface. He'd gone back to his normal routine of work and gaming, and rarely mentioned our trip unless I brought it up. But I noticed he'd started keeping his apartment door locked during the day, something he'd never done before. About 6 weeks after we'd turned the box over to the sheriff's department, I finally got a call back. It was Deputy Rodriguez, and he sounded tired. "Mr. Patterson, I wanted to follow up with you about that box you and your brother found on the trail." "Did you find anything useful?" I asked. There was a pause. "The contents appear to be authentic, at least in terms of age and the photographic materials used. The handwriting has been analyzed, and it's consistent with samples we have from someone who was questioned in connection with the Walsh disappearance back in '97. "So it's real?" "The materials are real, yes. Whether the claims made in the letter are accurate is another matter. The person who wrote it was considered an unreliable witness at the time. He'd been camping in the area for several weeks and had been drinking heavily. His story kept changing, and he couldn't provide consistent details about what he claimed to have seen." I felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. "So it's not evidence of a crime?" "I didn't say that. The photos are interesting. Our detectives are taking another look at the original case file to see if there's anything that was missed the first time around." "What about the box itself? Where do you think it came from?" Deputy Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "That's where things get a little strange, Mr. Patterson. The person who wrote the letter, his name was Thomas Brennan, died in a car accident in 1998, about 6 months after Jennifer Walsh disappeared. So either he hid that box before he died, or someone else put it there using his materials." The implications of this hit me immediately. "You mean someone else has been sitting on this evidence for 25 years? Or someone wanted it to be found now, for reasons we don't understand?" After I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been manipulated somehow. The box had been too easy to find, too perfectly preserved, too conveniently placed where curious hikers would be likely to spot it. Someone had wanted us to find it. But why? I started researching Thomas Brennan online, trying to learn more about the man who had written the letter. There wasn't much information available. A few brief mentions in the news coverage of Jennifer Walsh's disappearance, an obituary from 1998, and some records from the local homeless shelter where he'd apparently stayed occasionally. What I found painted a picture of a troubled man who'd been living rough in the mountains for several years before Jennifer's disappearance. He'd had problems with alcohol and had been arrested several times for trespassing and public intoxication. According to the news reports, his claims about witnessing Jennifer's disappearance had been inconsistent and contradictory. But the photos in the box told a different story. They were methodical, carefully composed, and clearly showed a progression of events. Whatever Thomas Brennan's other problems, he'd been lucid enough to document what he'd seen in a systematic way. I also found something else that made my blood run cold. In researching the area where we'd been hiking, I discovered that there had been other disappearances over the years. Not just Jennifer Walsh, but at least 3 other people who had vanished while hiking alone in that section of the trail. Most disturbing of all, I found a forum post from just 2 months before our trip. Someone with the username Trail Watcher had posted a cryptic message. "The truth is still buried in the mountains. Someone needs to finish what Thomas started." The post had generated only a few responses, mostly from people dismissing it as the ramblings of another conspiracy theorist. But the timing was too coincidental to ignore. I showed the forum post to Jake, and for the first time since our trip, I saw real fear in his eyes. "You think someone planted that box for us to find?" he asked. "I think someone wanted that box found, and we were just the unlucky hikers who happened to come along," I replied. "But why us? Why now?" That was the question that kept me awake at night. We were just ordinary guys who'd stumbled across something we weren't supposed to find. But someone had been watching us that night in the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our involvement in this wasn't over. 3 months later, my suspicions were confirmed when I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: "You found it." The message was brief: "Thank you for doing what needed to be done. Thomas would be proud. The truth is finally coming to light." I forwarded the email to Deputy Rodriguez, but he said there was no way to trace it. It had been sent through an anonymous server, and the account had been deleted immediately after sending. More emails followed over the next few weeks, always from different addresses, always cryptic. Others have found boxes too. The mountains remember everything. Jennifer wasn't the only one. I changed my email address, but the messages kept coming. Whoever was sending them seemed to have no trouble finding my new contact information. The final email was different from the others. Instead of a cryptic message, it contained a single photograph, a recent picture of me and Jake hiking on a different section of the Appalachian Trail, taken the previous weekend during what was supposed to be a day hike to help us get over our fear of the woods. We hadn't told anyone where we were going. I haven't been back to the mountains since then. Jake and I have talked about it, but neither of us can bring ourselves to return to the place where this all started. Sometimes I wonder if we should have left that box where we found it, if our curiosity has somehow made us part of something larger and more dangerous than we understood. The official investigation into Jennifer Walsh's disappearance was quietly reopened, but I haven't heard anything about progress in the case. Deputy Rodriguez retired 6 months after we found the box, and his replacement doesn't return my calls. I still get emails occasionally, always from new addresses, always with messages that suggest the sender knows more about what happened to Jennifer Walsh and what's still happening in those mountains than they're willing to say directly. Last month I received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about another hiker who had gone missing in the same area where we'd found the box. Attached was a handwritten note. The pattern continues. The mountains keep their secrets, but some secrets want to be found. I don't know who's sending these messages or what they want from me and Jake. I don't know if we were chosen at random or if there was something specific about us that made us targets. But I do know that finding that box changed something fundamental about how I see the world. The mountains that once felt like a refuge now seem full of hidden dangers and watching eyes. Every time I see news about a missing hiker or an unsolved disappearance, I wonder if there's another box hidden somewhere in the woods, waiting for the right person to find it. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we were meant to be the ones who found Thomas Brennan's evidence, or if we were supposed to become part of the pattern ourselves. Those footprints around our campsite, the sounds in the woods, the emails, they all suggest that someone has been keeping track of us since that night. I've considered going to the FBI, or to a journalist, or someone else who might be able to make sense of what we've stumbled into. But I'm afraid that drawing more attention to ourselves might be exactly what whoever is behind this wants. So, I wait, and I watch my email, and I try to convince myself that we were just unlucky hikers who found something we weren't supposed to find. But deep down, I know that's not the whole truth. The mountains of Appalachia have been keeping secrets for centuries, and we've somehow become part of those secrets. I don't know what that means for us, or what whoever is watching us wants us to do next. But I have the uncomfortable feeling that our part in this story is far from over.